This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 365. How the finance sector is underestimating the risk on climate.
Now, how often have disaster junkies in the media predicted all kinds of climate catastrophe?
Every time the temperature rises, later the carbon dioxide rises. And it's not the carbon dioxide causing the temperature rise, it's a natural temperature rise causing the carbon dioxide rise.
We've even got students flying up from London to support this net zero COP26.
But the real underlying thing is that there is no climate crisis. You know, I was originally an aerospace engineer, and
the issue of global warming has been politicized. I think that there are a substantial number of scientists who have manipulated data.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, just a small sample there of some of the voices talking out against climate change. Some of them are scientists, others are like Australia's Andrew Bolt, an arts degree dropout who somehow became a political commentator and apparently a climate change expert as well. So when we have this mix of opinions, will we ever tackle climate change if we can't agree that there's even a problem? Today, we look at Steve's report for Carbon Tracker, which is an independent think tank that is looking at the impact climate change has, or is having, or could have, on the finance sector. Are capital markets and pension funds really taking it seriously enough? Or do they listen to Andrew Bolt too much? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So, Loading the Dice Against Pension Funds is the title of the report for Carbon Tracker that Steve has authored. It's freely available on Steve's Patreon site or on Substack or on the Carbon Tracker website as well. It suggests pension funds are not adequately considering the risk of climate change. Now, it's a quick and easy read, so give it a go. There's no formulas, but there are lots of numbers, and not all of them are right, and that's the problem. It shows the muddled state we are in right now when it comes to tackling climate change, or even recognizing that it is an issue. But, Steve, it seems like there are two issues at play here which are holding us back. One, which is the point you make in the report, that economists are being peer-reviewed by other economists and not by climate scientists. Therefore, they're completely underestimating the risk. The two sides of science, if economics is a science, aren't talking to each other. The other is that the finance profession is completely obsessed with the here and now, isn't it? Which is not something you touch on the report, but I mean, the focus really is on whether the Fed is going to lift interest rates again, rather than whether we're going to see catastrophic climate change in the next 10 years. So that is equally a problem.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, pension funds, as you say, they're looking after people's pensions, and you should hope that anybody who's got a pension is going to live of the order of 20 years. So that should be your time horizon. But because they're financial corporations and they've got all the pressures of the stock market and shareholdings and competitors and so on, they're basically working to the same 3-month cycle everybody else is. What's the 3-monthly rate of return? Is it up? Is it down? How do we compare to our peers? So everything is incredibly short-term focused.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Those who potentially downplay the significance of climate change on the economy, I mean, that includes the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel that, has been criticised so heavily by climate change deniers. Because we've got the IPCC, and this is in your report, saying 4 degrees of warming would see a 10 to 23% decline in annual GDP by 2100 relative to global GDP if there wasn't any warning. 23% is a lot, 10% not much so much, but 4 degrees is a significant change to our climate. So if we take the best scenario out of that, 4-degree change, even the IPC is saying, well, maybe it would be a 10% impact on global GDP by the end of this century, which, a lot of people would say, well, we can live with that.
Yeah, so that's exactly the point. I mean, the IPCC recruits experts in each of the fields in which they're inquiring. And one of the areas, of course, is economics. So all they do, and this is quite legitimate, but also it's quite tragic, they go and check the economic journals and see who are the people who published on climate change in the leading economic journals. And they're the ones who go and then sit in the economic silo within the IPCC, and they reproduce their reports based on the economic literature. And that claim of a 4-degree increase in temperature by the end of the century causing between a 10 and a 23% fall in GDP, that is a direct lift from the paper in the economic literature that at the moment gives the most extreme predictions of the impact of climate change by people like Burke, I think, of the 2015 and 2017. And that is so typical of this literature, simply extrapolated the impact of change in temperature on GDP between 1960 and 2014, I think, in their paper, and then projected that forward as if there was going to be no change in the structure of the climate. Well, that's the bloody point. There is going to be a gigantic change in the structure of the climate. The relationships that applied before we hit tipping points is going to be nothing like the relationship between temperature and GDP after we hit tipping points. But bang, that's what they've put in the papers. And because academics do work in silos, very, very few people, I happen to be one of them, but very, very few people in the academic world read papers outside their own intellectual area. So the climate scientists who are publishing dire warnings about what is going to happen at 1.5 and 2 degrees, most of them aren't aware that in the same volume as by the IPCC, the economists are saying there's going to be a 10 to 23% fall in future GDP. And what that means is, and they actually say it this way in the report, the GDP will be 10 to 23% lower than it would be in the absence of climate change. So that 10 to 23% means that rather than GDP in 80 years hence being 5 times what it is today, it'll only be 4 times. So there's still projecting a rate of economic growth.
And in the absence of climate change. So there's, I mean, the reason why you could look at that and say, well, that's not a problem, because you'd look at, you know, how GDP would be rolling in a world where more people are getting wealthy. We're seeing more people being pulled out of poverty into the middle class. We're seeing GDP growing quite considerably. So some people might say, well, you know, in that time, GDP might have doubled or trebled. So losing 10% of that doubling just means we're growing a little bit slower, but we're still growing. Nothing to worry about.
To quote Stuart Kirk from the Financial Times conference, where with Stuart Kirk when he was the HSBC specialist on economic and social gains, what they call the ESG, he said, you won't even notice. And that's exactly the way that people have thought about this in the main. It's so far in the future, it's so trivial for the next 1 or 2 centuries that maybe, like if you compound the decline in the rate of growth that implies over 80 years, then you get a substantial difference between what GDP ends up being and what it would have been without that factor. But if you take a look at the rate of economic growth, you get a number which is so obviously trivial that you have to say, hang on, what's going on here? And of course, the economists don't publish those numbers. When they say 10 to 23% lower, that means, like I said, 4 times larger rather than 5 times larger. That translates in a fall of the annual rate of economic growth of less than 0.02%. Now, that is 1/5 of the accuracy with which we report current statistics on change in GDP in the past. So it's saying it's so trivial you can't even measure it. And that's the attitude that most people in the finance sector have had, and they are tragically wrong.
And look, I know you're no fan of Nordhaus, and understandably so, because he does.
There's people I dislike more.
Well, I mean, there are economists who argue. I mean, at least
I think on one hand.
So,
which would be in the shape of a fist.
Right. Okay. Well, steady on now. But I mean, so Nordhaus. I mean, at least he might underplay the impact of climate change, but at least he recognises there's going to be some sort of impact, even though it's fairly trivial as far as he's concerned. I mean, there are some who argue the other way, that actually climate change might actually help grow GDP. So go figure. I guess their argument is, well, we've got this whole new green industry which is being generated from it. So if we assume that climate change will have no impact whatsoever except for generating new jobs as we start to mitigate climate change, then you could level that argument.
That's the sort of thing that's been done by some of those people. I mean, they talk about, you read climate deniers saying things like, carbon dioxide is plant food. Well, fundamentally, that's where some of the economists get their argument about a positive impact from up to 1 or 2 degrees warming. So Richard Toll, who certainly belongs on that 5-fingered hand of mine, compared to Nordhaus, he predicted that before we reach 1 degree of warming, he claimed that 1 degree of warming would cause a 2% increase in global GDP. And that's mainly because of what he saw as a beneficial impact of more carbon dioxide and higher temperatures on agriculture.
Yeah, and the British wine industry, which is obviously going to mushroom as it's going to be mushroom wine.
There won't be any Italian one left, so you've got a total market opening there. It is that level of childish naivety, and this is what terrifies me, that people think that the economists have done the right thing, which in everybody that I was working with before I started reading the literature had the same attitude, that economists are taking the climatic damage estimates from scientists and then converting that into economic impact and putting a discount rate upon it. And the whole debate amongst economists is that, they've got the discount rate is too high. Well, that's not at all the point. They've made up their own numbers, and this is what I go through in the report. They literally, and the very first one of this series was William Nordhaus in 1991, assuming that 87% of American economy, which is extrapolating to the global economy, 87% would be unaffected by climate change because it happens in carefully controlled environments that are negligibly exposed to the climate.
This is like Nordhaus's idea that most of our work's done inside, so who cares what's going on outside?
Yeah, so all we need to do is air condition the fields and we'll be fine. It is literally, it's so bad. I mean, when I read this stuff, I was expecting bad work by neoclassical economists. They think they do good work. I'm, having spent my time working with mathematicians and scientists, I'm rather more skeptical of the quality control levels inside economics. But at least I expected them to be working with data they got from the science world. But that's not. They've made up their own numbers. And that's why they get these ridiculously small damage estimates.
Yeah. And the whole problem with economists is anyone can call themselves an economist these days. People have called me an economist, for God's sake. I have told them, how dare you? But I'm not qualified in any way whatsoever.
That wouldn't be a trouble, because that would mean a PhD might do you do better work.
Yeah,
and frankly, if you haven't done a PhD in economics, you're likely to do better work than anybody who has.
So everyone's an economist apart from those people who are qualified, and it seems to be the argument then, isn't it? So, you do get, right-wing nut jobs on, GB News and this new right-wing media that's emerged in the UK. You're hearing, and, nutty right-wing politicians as well, one of whom, the deputy chair of the Tory party, saying that, we can cope with temperature variations. He went from, I don't know where he was, somewhere where it was -4 degrees, and then he went to Malta where it was 36 degrees or something, and he managed to cope with that heat variation well enough, thank you. So the human race can survive through all of these different temperatures based on this one trip that he's made.
That actually, I wouldn't mind if that's just a Tory as you said, right-wing nut job, showing that he knows nothing about the climate. But you can find exactly the same comments from Richard Toll, who was one of the most prominent of these neoclassical economists working on climate change, and who has literally, in conversations, said that in tweets, which I'll find again, has said that the actual prediction of temperature increase is less than the diurnal range. And then the people who say this is going to be a problem have not made their case sufficiently. That is garbage. I can't believe that anybody with any modicum of intelligence can actually argue that, but that's the sort of stuff he says, and he's the most extreme of those economists, but that's typical.
But Steve, there are people living in hot countries like Australia, for example, where the GDP is doing very well, thank you. So if cold countries become hotter, then they'll just continue to do well, won't they? Because all they'll do is that's exactly his argument, isn't it?
That's exactly the argument, and that's so naive. You shouldn't be allowed near a academic institution, let alone involved in the most important issue humanity's ever confronted.
Right. So it's the simplicity of the models is the part of the problem, isn't it? So Nordhaus used the DICE model. So quickly, what exactly is the DICE model, and what is its main failing, apart from its simplicity?
We only got a 45-minute podcast, haven't we?
I hope so.
I'll give my best. Okay. First of all, the DICE stands for Dynamic Integrated Climate and Economics. So that's the argument. It's dynamic. It integrates climate and economics. It concludes its own mathematical model of the climate restricted only to temperature. So again, what I thought people would be doing before I started reading the literature was that economists would take what's called a global circulation model, GCM, which scientists develop, and would then plug that into economic analysis. Now, instead, they've made up their own models, and those models, so beginning with Nordhaus's DICE in 1994, I think he published the first version of it, only have temperature. They don't have precipitation. So all those people who are about to be wiped out, have their farms wiped out in Southern California when Hurricane Hillary hits, pardon me, say that again. All those people who got their houses wiped out by Hurricane Hillary when it hit in California recently, that's not the fault of climate change, because we don't include precipitation in our models of climate. So that is just bizarre, leaving that particular reality out of the thinking. So temperature-based only model of the impact of rising CO2 on global temperature.
No, but presumably he'd say that's fine, because what we're doing is taking that temperature as the output from these climatic models. So those climatic models are saying, well, okay, this is the temperature we're going to see as a result of this, which will be a multivarious factors, but this is the one output that we see as being the key variable.
Yeah, but if they weren't also trying to do it at the regional level, I would not be as angry about this. But they've actually then broken rice into what they call DICE into what he calls RICE, which stands for regional. And then they're saying what's going to be the impact on different countries around the planet. Now, at that point, at the global level, okay, to some extent, maybe you could just model temperature. But when you start to regionalize it, you simply cannot leave out what's going to happen from precipitation as well, when temperature changes cause changes in precipitation patterns, and of course increase the amount of rainfall and increase the force of storms as well, which we're seeing, with the cyclones in America recently, and floods all over the bloody planet, and weird phenomena of floods. So it would be okay, but at the regional level, of course you're going to change the precipitation patterns. Now, one thing, again, I'm going to quote Toll quite regularly when we talk here. Toll modeled the impact of losing what's called the AMOC, which is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. It's something which runs parallel to the Gulf Stream. It's often misidentified as being the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a surface phenomenon. The AMOC is an underwater phenomenon. But it's one of the main engines bringing heat to Europe. And so he said, well, if we have global warming and then we also have that triggering the collapse of the AMOC, because global warming will make Europe too warm, the AMOC will counter that a bit and actually make things better. So he predicted losing the AMOC would increase global GDP by 1.1%. Now, in that, of course, you can't, when you're talking regions, you can't leave precipitation out. And he then said that we assume that precipitation scales with temperature, by which he means that the temperature moves closer to the ideal level, which I think is about 13 degrees Celsius on average, then so will rainfall. So if the temperature gets better, so will the rainfall. Tell that to the people in Southern California.
Yeah, but isn't the real factor, the thing that's going to have most impact on GDP is the amount of suitable land we've got for growing stuff. And, that's going to be the factor. We can't grow as much because temperature and lack of rainfall just changes in the climate generally mean that we've got less arable land, workable arable land. That's going to be the significant factor that's going to impact GDP, presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, again, when you look at a study done by scientists on the same issue, this is Tim Lenton and colleagues doing work for the OECD in 2021. They looked at the collapse of the AMOC on much similar circumstances to what Nordhaus argued, and Toll argued, and they said that there'd be a fall in the amount of land which is capable of supporting wheat from 20% of the Earth's surface to 7%.
Right, but that doesn't find its way into the economic models.
No, that's the trouble. So we go just back to DICE again.
So the key factor that will influence the economy is the factor that is not making itself transferred from those climatic models to the economic models.
Many
the most
factors,
important number.
Yeah. And they literally just think we can suddenly shift agriculture from Idaho to Siberia. And I'm not joking. There are papers which say that the losses in America will be compensated by growing extra grain in Siberia. Well, I'm sure that'll improve American-Russian relationships no end.
Well, there's also
naivety.
Yeah, well, there's politics as well, of course. Yeah, but could we engage in? And this, I'm sure, is part of the counter to that. Can we engage in more intensive agriculture, like using greenhouses and vertical farming and the like, or we just get used to the taste of eating insects, which are apparently very good for you. Not very good for those who've got a failing eyesight like me. You can't even see your dinner. But generally, there's a way of mitigating against this if we just change our diet and the way we produce food. I mean, we've been doing that for decades.
You read my favourite paper on this front, which is publicly available, by the way. So if people want to read and see just how ludicrous these economists are, they can download this particular paper. And it's called A Survey of Experts Survey on Climate Change, done by Nordhaus in 1994. And in that paper, you'll see them talking about the incredible adaptability of human societies. Now, what they're talking about is we adapt as we spread across the planetary surface. So we begin in Africa, we spread it over the entire planet. We range from Eskimos to hunters and gatherers on the Serengeti. There's an enormous, each of our regional cultures is adapted to the local climate, and so that shows we can because we can change across geography. We can change through time. Let's assume space is the same as time. I wish I was making a joke there, but I'm not. That's virtually a direct quote from Toll in the paper in 2009. So they simply transpose the geographic spreads which have done over the last 10,000 years to assuming we can make the same change as global temperature rises in the next century. And that is just ludicrous.
So what is the best way then? If the DICE model makes no sense, if we're not seeing this interplay between climate models and economic models, what is the best way of getting an accurate handle? Because whatever we do, we're going to get a range, aren't we? And I'm not quite sure how useful that range is. Like, you seem to be saying we're nowhere near it, that the real percentage risk is going to be much higher. How do we get closer to something which is meaningful?
Well, this has actually come out of work that I've done and the way that Tim Lenton, who's the professor of climate science at Exeter University, between the two of us, we've come up with a method. So we're going to be working on a research project for this now. And that is that what economists have done, and this is continuing a bit on the DICE argument, they've simply taken numbers they've made up about damages and then fitted a quadratic to it, so y equals x squared, where y is damages and x is the temperatures. They're saying the damages are going to be proportional to the temperature rise squared. And out of that, that's how Nordhaus predicts that, for example, 6 degrees of global warming would reduce global GDP by 8.9%. 6 degrees of warming. Now, what I argued in a paper that I wrote with Tim critiquing the work of economists on tipping points was that you shouldn't be fitting climate change data with a quadratic, because a quadratic, the slope of a quadratic changes, but the rate at which that slope changes is constant. There's never a variation. And that is obviously wrong for models.
So you need step change.
No step change whatsoever. No increase in the rate of change of the slope.
Right. Yeah. So the model has to have a step change to be realistic, you're saying?
It has to be, to have any chance of realism, you must have a step change or an acceleration in the rate of acceleration. And so two ways you can do that are using a simple exponential function. So rather than y equals x squared, y equals 2 to the x or e to the x, where x is the temperature change. And that gives you literally explosion. That's what gives you explosive population growth and so on. And that's what gives you a chain reaction in a nuclear reactor. And that just runs until the thing blows everything up. So that you should fit a function like that. The middle road is to fit what's called a logistic, which if people have ever seen the diagram for product adoption over time, it'll start with a very small number of people who bought the product, then it rapidly accelerates, and then it tapers to maybe 100% of the population having a mobile phone, for example. That's called the S-curve in marketing and a logistic curve in mathematics. And we said what we should be doing is using that curve. Now, what I did in the paper we're discussing for Carbon Tracker, I took data on billion-dollar damages, a database stored by the National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration Authority in America, otherwise known as NOAA. And NOAA's been maintaining a database of environmental crises that caused $1 billion or more of damages, working in 2015 US dollars since 1980. And I took that data and I fitted the quadratic the economists use, the exponential and the logistic. And that gave me, rather than with the economic prediction, the quadratic y equals x squared, that predicted 20% damages to GDP, future GDP, at 6 degrees of warming. But the logistic predicted there'd be no economy left at 5, and the exponential said no economy left at 4. degrees warming. So Tim looked at that and said, that's the sort of thing we should do. So in his paper, which is put out by the University of Exeter just shortly before ours, that paper said, why don't we work backwards from the temperature level that we scientists think would destroy human civilization, and to use the logistic curve back to now, to current data.
Right.
So we're going to do that.
That makes sense. Because I mean, it is crazy to say, well, okay, there's nothing left, but we'll still have GDP, even though there's no humans. So the economy has just, presumably, we just passed it on to the cockroaches, and they've worked out how to become financiers.
Oh, nobody is, well, not many people are saying complete extinction of the human race. Lots of people are saying a collapse in human civilization, which means that the agriculture and manufacturing systems we have, which are fundamentally sedentary. You don't move your wheat farmer on a daily basis. You don't move your factories around either. They're fixed in spots. If those spots get wiped out by various dramas of climate change, like the storms we've seen in California, the storms in Milan, the collapses, you would have seen, maybe you've seen some catastrophic flooding in India recently, which just wipes out a whole village. That damage, you can't have that happening and still have an industrial system. So you'd go from what we can support with a industrialized manufacturing and agricultural system across to what we can support without it. And then I'll use one economist a scientist who's died since he made the claim. This is Will Steffen, and he claimed that 4 degrees of warming was probably compatible with about 1 billion humans surviving, which means 7 billion people dying.
Right.
Now, what our scientists do is say, well, what temperature level do you think would be such that there'd be no potential for an organised industrial and agricultural society in the future, and then extrapolate back from that. And we're going to do that as a research project. And that will then say, this is the damage function you should be using, not the nonsense you guys have made up, but one that scientists have produced through their decent system of peer review.
Right, okay, hold that thought, because I've got a question on that, but I'll save it till after the break. It's the Debunking Economics podcast. It's me and Steve Keen. We are back in just a second.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So, Steve, you're talking about, developing a more realistic model where we understand what the end point is, where we accept the fact that the temperature's raised to a certain point and we have the scientists' expectation of how many people are going to be left at that point. And so the question is, how quickly do we get there? What is the curve that's going to take us there? What are going to be the catastrophic events along the way? And isn't there a danger? I mean, you talked about, using a formula where you're looking at the rate of accelerating. Isn't there a danger when you're doing that kind of modelling that you might overestimate one of the factors that contributes to that? So you could be saying, well, okay, this is going to happen much worse, much more quickly than just because in what would be a very sensitive model, you got a number ever so slightly wrong.
Well, that's why we're going to do a survey of climate scientists. And the idea of this is actually given by a recent paper in the economic literature. Again, this is publicly available. I do recommend people download it and take a look at it and see what economists believe is feasible. Two authors, Howard and Sylvan, Sylvan, in 2021, published a survey of economists where they looked through the 25 leading economic journals. Of course, I don't have a publication in those 25. No heterodox economist virtually would have a publication. And look for those for papers in the top 25 journals on climate economics in the last 20 years. And they got a survey of about 2,200 economists and then sent them out a survey. And one of the questions in the survey was, what damage to future GDP do you expect to have from climate change of, and they gave a pattern, 1.5 degrees, I think, by 2030, 3 degrees by 2050, 5 degrees by 2120, and 7 degrees by 2220. Now, the median prediction that came out of that was that trajectory would end up with GDP in 2220 being 20% lower than it would have been without climate change, which means that rather than being 21 times what it is today, it would be 17 times what it is today. And that's where they got the figure that the impact on the rate of growth they assume from a trajectory leading towards 7 degrees of warming that would reduce the annual rate of economic growth by 0.02%. Now, the annual rate of economic growth is normally about 2%. So we're saying about a 1% fall in the rate of economic growth from a trajectory leading to 7 degrees of warming. And that is insane. But that's what economists believe.
Now, your report for Carbon Tracker is suggesting that pension funds are underestimating the risk, which is where we started this conversation, and therefore people's pensions are at risk. But the question is, the two questions really: where would pensions really be getting more accurate information on which to base that risk? And even if they were able to adequately assess the level of risk, even if they had that range of numbers, which we believe are accurate over a certain time frame, what do they do with that information? Because, they've still got, people's investments. It's still got to go somewhere. What are the alternatives to the conventional channels, the conventional financial instruments that people are using today?
Largely the alternative, that where would we be if that was what financial advisors had actually thought was the case 20 or 30 years ago? Because this has been happening for 20 or 30 years now. It's downplaying, actually longer, right back to 1972, when Nordhaus stupidly trashed the results of the limits to growth paper without understanding the dynamics or the logic behind the paper. So for 50 years, economists have been pumping out this stuff, trivializing the dangers, and people in finance have been accepting these arguments. And then, of course, what we're dominated by now, I describe as the political financial complex. Eisenhower coined the idea of the military-industrial complex. What really dominates policy these days is the cabal of politicians with the finance sector. So if the finance sector had been saying, oh, hell, if we let the temperature rise by 2 degrees, we should destroy human civilization, I think the politicians might have had different behavior over the last 30 or 40 years. So instead, what's happened is we've delayed and, dramatically, and we're now seeing crazy climate events that people said this is the sort of thing which is feasible if we don't slow down. We're now having it happen. So what I would hope happen is the pension funds would see this and say, holy hell, this is not something we can manage just by reallocating our share portfolios. We have to get action on addressing climate change at the governmental level, and we would have had a change in the political atmosphere around climate change.
But that's not the job of pension funds to do that. A pension fund is there obviously just to say, well, okay, we've got this money. How to maximise the return on it, rather than being a lobby group per se. And they may say, pension funds may say in the short term, hey, destruction can be constructive as far as GDP is concerned. So, the situation in Hawaii was quite horrific. Obviously, it's awful that so many people lost their lives, but there's now going to be a massive construction program happening there, which is going to add to GDP.
Well, no, it's not going to make up for the damages.
But for people who've got a portfolio, they'll be saying, "Great, let's put it into construction in Hawaii because that's where the money's going to go."
Yeah, then they would be doing that sort of thing. So we have an enormous naivety overall. But I think if you had the fear that we should genuinely have about the situation we've got ourselves into, if that got transmitted to pension holders and became part of the political scene, then the resistance the public currently has to climate change action, I think, might slowly start to evaporate. Whereas instead, the public, the public will mouth things about climate change, and some people are very active and committed about it, obviously. But in general, people will vote for somebody who's trivialising the dangers or doing, like we're seeing with the attitude that Australians now are developing towards the Albanese Labor government. It's all, a shadow play. It's doing things that look like make action, and at the same time you're approving 100 new coal mines. So I think the approval of the coal mines might not be happening if pension funds were saying, well, we're not going to put any money at all into fossil fuels. That's going to be, a disaster.
Right. So it's withdrawing the investment in steps in the wrong direction. So for example, Rishi Sunak, although maybe it doesn't require investment from pension funds, but when Rishi Sunak's saying, well, okay, we're going to offer all of these licenses, which they are for North Sea oil exploration, but hey, we're going to negate that because we're going to have carbon capture schemes, which is going to make everything good.
Which is another myth. That's all. None of those schemes have worked. It's just it's a mask behind which they hide what they're actually doing. It looks like the carbon capture is never going to work on the scale. None of those schemes have succeeded. So it's saying we can continue mining fossil fuels because we can extract the carbon. No, we can't. It's farce. You've got to stop extracting the carbon in the first place.
Right. So you're saying pension funds have got to have a conscience. I'm surprised, and I guess there is a bit of, you can invest in renewables and choose pension plans which are going to be, that are green friendly rather than earth unfriendly. I mean, they do exist. People have got the choice, haven't they, as to whether they subscribe to those plans.
But the trouble at the moment is there's very little choice, because virtually everybody, all these people, the reason pension funds are getting it wrong is they're taking the advice of consultants, and the consultants are reading the economic literature and saying, okay, these are the predictions of temperature changes, and they're therefore saying, like in some pension funds have been told that 2 degrees is optimal. 2 degrees will improve their portfolio performance. So it's this misleading impact of the economic literature. And if we got rid of it and said 2 degrees means, potentially elimination of industrial civilization, then I think pension funds might change their advice somewhat.
So is there the role of a financial regulator here then? So if you were able to prove that the information that's being provided for people when they're making their decisions and who they invest in are based on falsehoods, that the return over time is not going to be what they're claiming it to be, because there's going to be consequences, then the financial regulator would want to know about that.
Exactly. And
but the problem is they haven't got the numbers to rely on to say, well, actually, you're wrong.
That's the financial regulators are getting in touch with us now after my paper and Tim's group from Exeter. So there is some possibility that they're the ones who are going to be most likely to consider our arguments immediately, because it isn't just the pension funds, it's all the financial regulators as well, the so-called network greening the financial sector, NGFS, that all the central banks belong to. They've all swallowed the same nonsense as well, which is not amazing because most of them are staffed by economists in the first place. So we are having a potential impact on the regulators, and that will again change what pension funds do. But the main thing of getting it for the regulators is we can get to the politicians.
It'd be interesting actually to see what the risk description is in the annual reports of fossil fuel companies, because obviously, again, I mean, if they are feeding a falsehood, I mean, it's a bit like the tobacco industry, isn't it, in the 70s?
Yeah, exactly the same thing. They're fundamentally, the whole thing is a bunch of falsehoods, and they are. When they start reading our report and Tim's group from Exeter, then they're realising that holy hell, we've been misled, and so I've got to do something else. So we're hoping we can get the central banks and financial regulators and government bodies in general to look at this literature and say we should never have trusted this. We have to change our policies.
But I'm just wondering at an individual level. I mean, I've got a pension. Everyone's got a pension, of course. And I'm not sure what would change knowing that there's a massive risk presented by climate change. How does it change my portfolio decisions? Okay, I might make more green decisions. I might buy green bonds. I might buy less shares in the wrong companies or no shares in the wrong companies. Or do I sell my house, buy gold, and head for the hills? It's what do I do having that information? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not. There's no simple solution for this. This is not a optimization issue. This is a dilemma, a huge dilemma, and there's individuals are in a very difficult situation because if the structure of society falls apart around you, what the hell can you do to survive? So it is the sort of thing where we have to demand collective action, and that's saying to politicians, we've got to take this stuff seriously, rather than the gestures you all make, carbon sequestration, and while you're still opening up more coal mines, we have to, as rapidly as possible, reduce our use of fossil fuels. We have to consider extreme measures like rationing at some point, because we're going to be forced into it if the destruction that scientists expect to see of agricultural productivity comes through. Then you can't let the price system decide who gets to eat, because then the poor starve, and that is then the breakdown of society. So there's a huge range of things people have to be prepared for, and they're not prepared for it at all at the moment.
No rationing if you eat the insects, of course. Start practicing now. At home. It's summer in Britain. There's a few bugs around. Just see what they taste like. You talk about a Minsky moment happening on climate change, and that is interesting as to whether we are going to hit a point. I mean, there's a lot happening right now. People are still saying, well, we've always had events like this. But are we going to get a Minsky moment when everything changes, when everyone all of a sudden gets on the same side and realizes that there's something quite catastrophic happening because it's just happened? And how far away could that Minsky moment be? And tied into that question, in the finance industry, they ignore the chance of all-out nuclear war. because what's the point of factoring in the risk of all-out nuclear war? Because the world's over. Whatever survives, the world is very different. So you can't factor in risk like that. And so, couldn't you argue, well, if climate change is going to be so horrific and there's going to be such a large Minsky moment, is it a bit like that nuclear war argument? How can you factor it in? Why should you even bother in your financial models?
Yeah, that is a serious issue, because you're not talking a crisis like 2008 where you can recover from it ultimately, and you can move out of real estate into other sectors while the collapse occurs, move out of banks, et cetera, or move back in because they ended up benefiting from the policies to recover from the crisis in the first place. So it doesn't have that adjustable capacity to it. And it basically says we've got to stop thinking about this as a market economy and start thinking about this as a war economy. How do we redirect all our efforts to reduce the impact of what's coming our way and to start building a human civilization which can survive the damage we've done already, and then start reversing that damage? And that has to be the first priority of human decision making from now on.
It's not going to happen till it happens, though, is it? Until we have that Minsky moment. So,
we are.
Apologies to any Americans listening, but I've not spent a lot of time in America, and I was horrified. And it was the Midwest. It wasn't. Well, no, it was the Midwest, the middle of America, anyway. And I just thought everyone here is very selfish. So the idea, they're not really too concerned about the people who live in the same street. So why would they be concerned about the future of the planet?
And I think we're not going to get serious action here until we get a serious catastrophe in America or Europe. That's what it's going to come down to, until something so breathtakingly catastrophic occurs that people go, oh, my God, then we're not going to get change in the policy direction. And in some ways, I keep on drawing the analogy with Winston Churchill in the Second World War. Nobody took his warnings about Hitler seriously until Poland and France had fallen and 250,000 British troops were about to be exterminated on Dunkirk. That's when they realized the seriousness of the threat from the Nazis. And it's going to take something of that scale before people realize just how serious the issues are. And the reason we've taken so long to get there, fundamentally, the economists have conned ourselves and themselves and us about the dangers. And they're the economists are the Chamberlains of human society.
Well, I think the media can take part of the blame as well, can't they? So I do know, if we were to open up comments on this, this podcast has got a bit of a niche following of fairly intelligent people. There are climate change deniers amongst them, but if this was being published in a mainstream newspaper, particularly the Daily Mail, then the responses, you're going to have a comment there from someone saying, the UK's less than 1% of the world's carbon footprint. Why should we care? Climate change is a scam. It's been going on for decades. There'll be someone there saying, look, I'll pay for Greta Thunberg's bus fare to China because that's where we should be protesting. And we see a lot of that going on. I fear that the tide, particularly with the cost of living crisis, the tide is turning the wrong way at the moment. So it's a bigger uphill struggle.
I agree entirely. Yeah, I agree. That is the problem. So, I can't see us making any change at all until people realize it's an existential threat to them by actually seeing it happen, if not in their own street, then pretty close by. That implies we won't, we won't do anything until after it starts, because the climate damage starts destroying our capacity to do anything. But that's one reason I want these reports to be read and taken note of, and particularly by politicians, because unless we start making preparations now, the damage that climate change will do will be that much harder to reverse when it does start hitting on a catastrophic scale at the level of things like food harvests, regional wipeouts by atmospheric river floods caused by atmospheric rivers and so on. We have to start preparing for it. And we're not.
So unless all economists are wiped out in a catastrophic climate event, we're going to have that challenge, aren't we, of trying to counteract falsehoods being presented. But if we can do that, then you feel like the way forward then is through regulation of the finance industry, of money, where money is finding itself, not finding itself in the wrong place by wrong arguments. That if we had the right arguments, money would find itself in the right place, and we wouldn't be supporting moves which are taking us in the wrong direction.
To some extent. You want to we didn't outsource the Second World War, and we won't be outsourcing climate change action again either. What
Putin outsourced his war. It didn't work out terribly well for him, did it?
The private sector will still be involved, but in the same way they were in the Second World War, which is they were told to make the tanks and make the ships, and the government finance paid for the whole effort. So I see us in that sort of mixed public and private world in the future.
Right, and that in itself is a big challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, a huge challenge. But if you're not where you're going to walk into it, then how the hell do you organise it in the first place? And that is one of the dangers. The complacency we currently have about the threats is one of the threats.
So look, it's an easy read, the Carbon Tracker report. It is a bit scary. If you haven't read it, I recommend you do. And it's been good mulling over it for the last 40 minutes or so. Good to talk, Steve.
Thank you, mate.
And that is the Debunking Economics podcast for this week. We are back again next week with another one. Thanks for listening.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.